Hello, everyone. I'm Joshua Slatko, contributing editor for MedAd News. Welcome to the latest episode of our podcast series, MedAd Views. Today, we have a very special guest, Jim Potter, the executive director of the Coalition for Healthcare Communication. Jim joined the CHC in 2023 after many years as a healthcare advocate and association executive, including stops at the American Academy of Physician Assistants, the American Chiropractic Association, and the New Hampshire Medical Society. As CEO of the CHC, a group made up of some of the industry's largest healthcare-focused agencies and networks, he helps to defend the right of healthcare professionals and consumers to receive truthful information regarding pharmaceuticals and medical products. Welcome to the show, Jim.
Thank you, Josh. I appreciate it.
My first question is, what keeps you up at night? What are the issues in the world of healthcare communications that concern you the most, that occupy the most of your bandwidth?
Well, I think over the last year, it's been this threat of an executive order from the president to ban healthcare marketing, or essentially direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical marketing, not in one channel, but across all channels. I think that was the immediate threat we faced, literally about when the administration came on board in January. We were able to deflect that. Now it's kind of morphed to more of a secondary, which is in retrospect probably in what we preferred, that they now have to go take a regulatory approach. But that's probably kept, I wouldn't say it's kept me up. It's kept a lot of other people up. It's kept me busy to articulate what's real, what's not, and then add all the flavor that you have with the administration's tariffs and how they're applying them and how pharmaceutical companies are adjusting to everything up to date. So with that, we have a lot of folks. We have the healthcare marketing industry, all those companies, all the tech companies, everyone associated with that. We have the pharmaceutical companies. We have companies that would be dramatically impacted by any kind of ad ban, in particular, probably broadcast media. But to a lesser extent, we have even sports teams, sports channels, other things like that could be impacted because they tend to use a lot of pharmaceutical advertising as part of their revenue. So anybody that could be impacted kind of by this broad ad ban. And I would say even I'm talking not only to pharmaceutical companies, but I'm talking to equity companies who are, okay, this company's thinking about making such and such a move. We really don't understand what's going on. Can you help educate us? So for most of it, what I've been doing, and it's been pretty remarkable. I think we've now done over 50 media interviews this year. We've done a dozen national conferences, and I've done over 80 briefings to individual companies, other groups to talk about these issues. So there's a lot of people who are really concerned, really don't know what's going on. And that's by intent. I think the administration, when it came this year, was to overload the box or fill the box, essentially with their strategy of executive orders, a lot of different things happening to keep people uneasy, and they just probably are. Our job is really to lay out to everyone what are the Supreme Court precedents, what's the FDA history on these issues, what's the congressional history. Be able to kind of fold that up to say, okay, what they want to do here, that's maybe a little bit more fictitious. Yeah, this is over here, this is more real, and this is what you should be paying attention to. So it kind of works into all the issues on a policy front we've been kind of talking about in healthcare marketing more recently.
You used an interesting turn of phrase earlier in that response. You said drawing the distinction between what's real and what's not. I assume you're talking about the different arguments for and against DTC promotion.
It's a good point, and most people would think that, but it's more let's just say the administration says a lot of different things, throws out a lot of different ideas, a lot of different proposals. And so, what's incumbent upon someone like me is what has real legislative authority?
Ah,
What has precedence? What doesn't have precedence? So, if we kind of jump in some of these issues, there's something called that they proposed the national security tariffs on both, I think, computer chips and pharmaceuticals. Now, I would say that's real because there's about 3 or 4 statutes that support doing that. And there's lots of precedents out there. So that's very, very real. And as you've noticed, that hasn't come forward quite yet because they're holding that back. That's kind of their ace in the hole. And that's why you've seen like $280 billion pledged by pharmaceutical companies because they know that's real. What's not as real is this concept of most favored nation tariffs. And that concept really doesn't have any root in any kind of it's not rooted in any kind of law, any regulations that we're aware of. In fact, the past 3 administrations either tried this and failed or looked at it and said, no, it's not really workable. So that would probably be a real distinction upon what's real and what's not so much. When you hear about them use most favored nation, is it really that they're trying to use that approach, or is it something different that they're doing it and kind of calling it most favored nation? So that's how this administration can kind of play on semantics and heartstrings to get people uneven. I met the president, I guess, 15 years ago, and I watched him use his tactic to get someone unsettled and kind of put them on the defense to try to leverage what he wants. So the president is really interesting. He loves leverage. He loves leverage in all of his personal and professional relationships. And so that's where he often starts from. So you kind of, when you're trying to you're in the midst of this, you kind of have to ask, okay, what is he doing? Why and who is he trying to leverage in this case? So, for instance, a broad-based ad ban on pharmaceuticals. Who would that impact? Yes, one, pharmaceutical companies. Two, it would hurt broadcast media companies, definitely, because somewhere between 20 and 40% of most media companies' revenues are based on pharma advertising. So if you took that away or somehow that was taken away overnight, that would radically impact them. And then, as we kind of mentioned before, you have other sports teams, others who use those kind of revenues in as part of their base. So they could also be impacted. It would also impact, of course, healthcare marketers who work with these pharmaceutical companies, and many of them, huge chunk of their bottom line is devoted to those agreements and the products that they're working on.
thank you. You were thinking much bigger than I was. I was only thinking about the very limited, the DTC arguments. This is a much bigger scope. In the past month, a lot of paper has been coming out of FDA. They have been increasing their usage of their letters, untitled letters and warning letters. They've released more than 50 of each. From where you're sitting, has this heightened level of scrutiny actually impacted DTC prescription drug ads and campaigns in general?
It has, either directly or indirectly. The untitled letters, which is the most often used format by the FDA historically. They have done about, as you mentioned, 50 of these, and about the majority, about 35 of these were targeted at DTC advertising. And most of these were, either transitions or use or of, background, either music or dancing while the risk and the contraindications were being indicated, or the font was too small or it wasn't presented for enough time that could be easily read. And these are all aspects of what they call the clear, conspicuous, and neutral rule that was finalized in 2023 and went enforced at the end of 24. So it's fairly recent, but what they really did is they focused on that. And I think what they did is they really tightened enforcement. So what you saw in these 35 letters is now companies going back and they're having to do most of the time, some editing. Sometimes there's some reshoots of some scenes and they're kind of rethinking about, okay, given this letter that we just got, how do we kind of redo this particular piece of advertising? That's the vast majority. The warning letters were really interesting that they were targeting these telemarketing compounding pharmacies. So the Hims and Hers, the Rose, all those companies that were out there. And it's really interesting to someone who's in this to say, does FDA really have authority over those companies or not? There's a turn of the century Supreme Court ruling that says, no, they don't. And to try to find the legislation that says they have authority over these compounding pharmacies and in turn their marketing, what they do on a broadcast. Those are great questions. And we'll kind of have to see. Remember that these letters are a process. You get a letter from the FDA, and usually they're not in this volume, but then the company looks at it and says, yes, we agree, or no, we think these, we disagree with these. And there's usually a conversation back and they kind of figure out how to move together. I'm not sure with this administration that there's that give and take. There might be. We don't really know what happens, but those processes haven't worked out. And particularly for these compounding pharmacies, it will be really interesting down the line if we see some lawsuits resulting, saying, thanks, FDA, but we don't think you have the authority, so we're going to kind of ignore you on this. That kind of push and shove will really kind of span out for a couple years. But really what FDA did is they kind of said, no, we're really tightening down on enforcement and how we interpret the CCN rules. And so they kind of shifted the goalposts without telling everyone. Typically, when FDA does this kind of shift, they do it through what they call a notice and consent rulemaking to say, okay, we're going to shift in this way, and we want you all to follow. And what this administration did is said, nope, you all are in violation. We've reinterpreted this. And so when I've talked to pharmaceutical companies, the first thing I point to is I go, okay, you had this advertisement cleared through FDA through an advisory opinion. It's kind of a standard process for typically ads that are of significant value. And so you went through this and said, I would really go back to that advisory opinion and see how it differs from this untitled letter that you got, and then try to draw conclusions on what your next steps might be. So that's where I see this was kind of, the administration, clearly Secretary Kennedy and FDA Commissioner Macri wanted to get people's attention. So this was a little bit of a shock and all kind of approach, and not kind of the typical gotcha approach that FDA really doesn't like to use, but they used in this particular case.
Right. Are the Hims and Hers of the world, the compounding pharmacies, are they a part of the CHC coalition? No.
No, they're not. It's a great question. The CHC, that is a subsidiary of the 4As, represents essentially advertising companies that pretty much exclusively do healthcare advertising in one form or another. Then we also represent medical journals, healthcare communications companies like Helio, Haymarket, and we also represent some medical journals and the advertising technology companies that support all these efforts are part of our membership. So great question.
Right. So if there were to be a litigation like what you described between the compounders and FDA over the issue of whether FDA has the regulatory authority to say what they said, that's not something you would be a part of.
Yeah, no, that's clearly they may be represented by an association of pharmaceutical compounders. but that's not really who our members were. And I would say most folks would say that these compounders are really kind of pushing the envelope on, if you kind of remember the Hims and Hers a Super Bowl advertisement, it really kind of pushed the envelope a couple different ways. And I think it actually backfired on them. Number one, that they were actually allowed by FDA at that time to, because of shortages, to essentially market, some of the GLP-1s. And soon after that, the company said, nope, no more shortages. And the FDA said, sorry, compounders, you're not out of business. So that's, a little bit of I think, a misplay by that particular company, an overstep. But most of these companies have been pushing the envelope, and that's why you saw about 50 of these warning letters going out, because they've been pushing it. There are good legal questions whether they are under FDA authority to be regulated or not, and particularly if their marketing for their products are under FDA regulation too. So that's going to probably take some time to play out a little bit longer, but except for maybe some agencies that represent these telemarketing compounders, that's good. More interesting is what the administration is allowing. Now it's not only allowing these direct to patient platforms for these compounders, but now they've kind of opened it up to all the pharmaceutical companies, and now under the title Trump RX, which is to be launched, I think, in January 2026. But the website has been just stood up, I think, this past weekend. So this is a place where pharmaceutical companies are going to offer their products at substantial discounts. Who will benefit from these? It's those individuals who need these products and can pay cash for them, essentially. Others who, don't have that, maybe it's not as useful to some of the Medicaid populations, folks who don't have kind of the ready cash to pay for, a particular drug that would cost them $500 a month or more. That's hard to do on Social Security or if you're on Medicaid. So we'll have to see how broadly those are used, but clearly, as part of their negotiations on the tariffs and everything else, the administration has welcomed and opened up the doors for these direct to patient platforms that are now being, I think, done by a lot of the pharmaceutical companies. We'll see this kind of roll out as part of the negotiations with the administration.
I definitely want to dig a little bit more into Trump RX a little bit later. But before we get there, just a couple more regulatory-ish questions. FDA recently announced a new rulemaking initiative on the adequate provision guidance from 1999, which could significantly impact how risk and benefit information is presented in DTC. So I'm curious what your view is if the guidance is changed, how it might be changed, and what the immediate and long-term consequences might be for DTC advertisers and patients.
Well, let's take a step back and look at what the marketplace looked, in the mid 90s or before this guidance came forward.
Right.
And so promotion was more physician centric. And so you had detailing, samples, journals, CME. And then along with it, you had consumer ads that were either print ads, and then you had the whole brief summary. So all the risk and the contraindications in fine print, on a print ad. Or what you had is mainly what I would call unbranded or reminder broadcast ads. The broadcast product claim ads were more infrequent, really, because the on-air risks that were part of these ads were, one, confusing because the pharmaceutical companies really didn't know or were uncertain how the FDA termed, and this is part of that rulemaking, the adequate provision for branded ads. And since the 1960s, when the first rules on healthcare marketing were essentially put in place, the FDA has provided alternative requirements for broadcast ads that are apart and different from print ads. And most people think that, oh, well, this guidance really opened the door in the 90s, and that's not true. Actually, this all baits the idea of the theme of adequate provision dates back to the original regulations in the 1960s. And so even though it was just focusing on physicians, FDA was clearly thinking, and probably they received this from Congress, that the broadcast ads should be much different or treated differently because of that meeting than the print ads. And so that carries forward. Now, what happened in that time was in the mid 80s in 1985, FDA said, we're going to take the same standards for essentially fair balance, risk, everything else that you kind of, the major statement, and we're going to apply those to consumers because we think the same standards, for physicians meet the same. So that happened in the mid 80s. What they, I don't think, anticipated when they did that was the use of different mediums by those two audiences. So physicians, when they got in, when you think about physicians, you think about continuing medical education, you think about them reading journal articles to learn up about a particular disease state or a particular pharmaceutical treatment. So that's how they kind of ingested their knowledge, where consumers, shorter times, shorter attention spans, they really preferred television and other mediums. Get me that information quickly. That's where I'm watching. And so I don't think FDA really anticipated that consumers would really take in pharmaceutical information at that time. And so it took a few years for them to kind of come around and say, for two reasons. One, we really haven't defined what we mean by adequate provision. And it's clear that consumers now in the early 90s and pharmaceutical companies were really confused on what was meant. What does adequate provision mean? And adequate provision, the definition is like you can provide outside the major risks. You have to state them in a television or other broadcast ad. But for the detailed information, for all the information, you could go to another source. Since a website, and when did the web become popular? The 1990s. You could take an 800 number, again, kind of another medium. They used to actually print these concurrently in magazines because people read magazines a lot more at that time. Or they would say, go to your pharmacist or your physician for that detailed information. And pharmaceutical companies would give this information to those kind of providers who would then give it to patients directly. So that really changed how we kind of come about this. And what happened after these guidances is that it really triggered what we saw is kind of more emotional appeals, shorter appeals on normalizing pharmaceuticals, prescription drugs. Before, there was something that, if you look, before, not too many people really kind of dug into them. But what also happened in the 1980s was the baby boomers, the old hippies at this time. The first brand of baby boomers were really kind of the 1960s hippies. And they were different than the greatest generation who said, thank you, Mr. Doctor, may I have another pill? The new baby boomers kind of said, no, we want to be part of our decision making. So those two things really impacted and set the stage for kind of the real rapid growth of direct-to-consumer advertisements in broadcast media. And what changed with that was really just that it really boosted public awareness of these treatments. It really helped treatment adherence. There's a lot of studies that go, if patients who follow these ads and who came in really actually are much more compliant and adherent to the treatment regimens, that are prescribed by their physician or NP or PA. It also encouraged all these activities really encourage more involvement in this joint decision making on, okay, what are we going to do? How much is it going to cost me? What are my alternatives in doing this? And so for healthcare marketers, I say now our job is really to educate patients and their caregivers. So when they go in to meet with their provider, there's a better and more efficient discussion on treatment options, what the risk are, what kind of the side effects are from various drug treatment regimens. So that's really going to be our goal, I think, going forward, and where we'll continue to evolve into more story making in these advertisements, apart from what you've maybe seen in the first or the last 20 years, which is song and dance about the benefits, and we'll speed read the contraindications and the risks. That's out. That's the CCN. It took a while to get up, but the CCN kind of threw out the speed reading. And now we have kind of the information has to be more balanced. The ads are more longer. And it really doesn't matter the channel because they whether it's TV, whether it's streaming, whether it's social media, they're going to have to be longer. They're going to have to include this information so patients can understand. So we're recommending the more you can story tell, the more that people can, take this information and make it real to them and they understand it, then the better off everyone is going to be and the better outcomes that you get ultimately for patients.
So essentially, it sounds like you feel that the initiative, if the 99 guidance is changed, it could be to the benefit of DTC advertisers by pushing them to provide more information for patients to educate them more.
Yeah, it really depends how. Right now, looking at, and all we have is the announcement from the 9th. They really haven't expanded on. They just said they're going to do a rulemaking. Now, there's a couple different ways that they can do this. If they do it through notice and consent rulemaking, then this is going to probably take 6 months to at least a year, where they go and they put out, say, a notice for proposed rulemaking or a proposed rule, and then they invite comments for 30 to 60 days. And then they'll come out with a proposed or a final proposed rule, and they'll get comments. And then they go through another step where they go to a final rule. And final rules, depending upon the level of agreement or non-agreement, can either be final or they can go forward. This particular administration has some challenges in rulemaking, or historically in the first Trump administration. It did, if you remember, in 2019, they tried to do an HHS rulemaking to essentially assert a price point in any kind of healthcare marketing, any kind of that was attached to any kind of pharmaceutical marketing. That failed miserably. It was beaten in the courts. One, because they attached it to this obscure HHS law that had no basis in reason, and I think FDA knew that when they did it. And the other reason, it didn't make sense. So they got beat bad in the courts. And what happened because of that, people didn't talk about it for 4 or 5 years. And so I think when we look at this, it really depends. They could just toss out the guidance and say, okay, de facto ad ban. If they do, though, I think what they invite is a lot of people suing the federal government on a number of grounds, not only the First Amendment, but the Administrative Procedures Act. And it was actually those two things. The Administrative Procedures Act was the primary thing that defeated the 2019 HHS rulemaking. It wasn't First Amendment. They threw the First Amendment in, but it was really they screwed up the process. Now, the other thing is, I'm not sure the administration really understands the entanglement here that they have with this guidance, and that it really originated in the 1960s with the Kefauver amendments in 1963. And so that's where it comes forward. So they have to go back and they would have, if they really want to change this in a radical way, they would have to go and change, what is that, 70 years of history, so to speak. That's a little harder. And then on top of that, you have the 2007 FDA Amendments Act they inserted this idea of clear, conspicuous, neutral rules. So throw on those, it'll be really easy to get crossways with either one of those two statutes if you just kind of pull the guidance. So we think right now the administration is going to go through a notice and consent, but you never know with this administration how they're going to do this. The other reason I would say they probably won't go through something is that disrupting the markets in a fragile economy, if it made all the stocks plunge with the pharmaceutical sales, which maybe the secretary would love to see happen, I'm not sure the president wants to see that happen. And actually, it's been very interesting on the September 9th announcements. They were going to do a press conference at the White House, and that was pulled, essentially canceled a half hour before it was going to happen. And I've been asked by a lot of lobbyists, well, where's the president on this issue? He hasn't spoken on it. Pulled out, and you saw FDA and HHS try to spin out all this information that evening, kind of on the last minute. So there is some separation here between the secretary and the president on these issues. My sense is if something's done and it upsets the economy or the markets, then everything implodes and people lose their jobs in the federal government. So I think we'll have to kind of see. I think that's a risk, or the part of the equation that the administration really has to take on what they're doing here with this approach. But I think overall, to get to your question is, will this change things? Will this make it longer? I think not necessarily. It really depends on the details and what kind of changes that they propose. They could propose that, how they specifically tighten the rules. It could be that simple. I don't think it's going to be that. I think, the secretary wants something more draconian. He wants to remove this type of advertising, from the field. So I think there's some conflicts between what the secretary wants to do, what the FDA can do, and perhaps what the president wants to see in all this. We'll have to see how it all plays out.
Sticking with FDA, it seems that the agency is growing increasingly aware of and seeking an increasingly significant regulatory role in the use of social media and social media influencers in pharmaceutical and healthcare communications. I mean, 10 years ago, that was the Wild West, and folks were just dipping their toes in it. But now the regulators seem quite aware of it and are increasing their focus on it. What do you think are the challenges that FDA is facing, the biggest challenges in that social media influencer digital landscape, and how should advertisers come to terms with this new degree of regulatory scrutiny to ensure compliance?
Yeah, that is an incredibly deep question, because there's a couple unknowns in this. One, if you look at the clear, conspicuous, and neutral final rule, it clearly says, it's referring to broadcast, but it says for television and radio in the title of the rule. It doesn't talk about social media. It doesn't talk about streaming, those other things at the time, while it's evolved. So you'll probably get some people say that, yes, FDA does have authority in these other channels. And it's not social media. I think it's all the other channels that have kind of evolved since the 1990s, when it was just the web. The challenges, I think, for marketing are this. I think those influencers that have an agreement with a pharmaceutical company are going to be told what the boundaries are. And they're going to say, stay in these boundaries. And they're probably going to tell them, okay, you pretty much have to follow the CCN rules, meaning that if you talk about the benefits of a drug, you have to talk about the risk and the contraindications. You can't kind of gloss over those. They have to be done, equally. It's really those social media influencers that just kind of jump in, and or maybe they're tied to something else, but not necessarily a pharmaceutical contract. So that's where it gets a little woolly. And there have been members of Congress who wanted to regulate social media influencers. I think that's a pretty tall order to try to do. But we'll have to kind of see, and we'll see over time if those bills. I think Senator Durbin introduced a bill in October of 2024 to essentially regulate social media influencers. So the questions are, does FDA really have authority over social media and other channels, other digital channels, or not so much? I think that kind of has to be figured out. Clearly, the FDA in its announcement said, we're going to pursue this. Again, whether they have the authority and can do this easily, or whether they face obstacles and challenges as they come forward, still hasn't been written yet. We're going to have to see how they pursue this. So it could be a rulemaker, it could be others, it could be beyond just the untitled and these warning letters that they've sent out today. So we really don't know, but it's a big question mark.
So, if one of your members were to ask for advice on how to pursue a particular social media campaign, given this uncertain sort of regulatory situation, is there any advice you could give them?
Yeah, we've been pretty clear for the last year, kind of looking at this like, to the best of your ability, apply the CCN across all digital channels. Don't differentiate. And the reason I usually tell is like, not only could you get one of these nice letters from the FDA, but I think the other one is, we know there's interest in Congress. And so let's just say a drug company comes out and says, okay, we do a television ad, but what we do in social media or what we do on streaming is totally different. We kind of ignore CCN. And what's going to happen is they're going to come in front of Congress and the senator is going to ask, Mr. Drug CEO, can you tell us how you're lying to the American public when you have one set of standards in this particular channel and a second set of standards for these channels that are maybe more people are watching? So tell me how you're lying to the American public. Tell me how you're hoodwinking all of us in doing this. And we always tell our member companies and pharmaceutical companies, you don't want to put your clients in that position. So the best piece of advice right now is to apply CCN across all digital channels.
Makes sense. Let's get back to Trump RX. So recently, a couple of big pharma companies, Pfizer, AZ, and EMD Serono, negotiated agreements with the government to participate in the Trump RX DTC purchasing platform, and reshore some of their drug manufacturing here in the United States in return for a 3-year waiver in tariffs. Is this going to be a thing? Is this going to be a trend? Do you see other pharma companies getting in line to try to join the party and work out similar agreements with the administration? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
Another great question. I think the answer is there are probably some pharmaceutical companies that weren't happy with Pfizer and AstraZeneca, that they went into an agreement with this administration because it's a voluntary agreement. They weren't forced to by law or anything else. But you have to unpack this entire situation to kind of understand. So back in May, the Commerce Department, through the president, basically said, we're going to impose these national security tariffs on computer chips and pharmaceuticals. And it's going to apply to essentially any manufacturing in the US and the major ingredients in anything that you're resourcing for these pharmaceuticals. So big, broad definition. So as we talked about earlier, there's some history, there's some statutes that support this, and the drug companies are taking it serious because they pledged like $280 billion to reshore. These are pledges. Now, my sense is a lot of these companies were moving in that direction, and that's why they kind of coughed this up. Not only because that the threat was real, but because of the disruptions during COVID, they saw that their supply chains were pretty disrupted in this country. And so I think a lot of these, you don't kind of overnight throw the switch and say, okay, we're going to spend an extra $10 billion to build manufacturing plants in the US. I think a lot of these were already in process. So it was like, yeah, well, we're thinking about this. Let's go do this. Let's mitigate any kind of threat of a tariff we have, number one. Then you have what is called most favored nation. And as we talked about, that was a proposal to essentially equalize the drug price in a peer country to its lowest price, whatever, say it's in Germany or in the UK, that the administration would pick, okay, you will pay that price in the US for that particular drug, that brand name drug. Again, that's been tried multiple times through multiple administrations. During the first Trump administration, they tried it as a demonstration project, and that was again defeated in court. So they said, you don't have the authority. So there's the whole idea of most favored nation is out there. Doesn't mean that they're not using it. And I think they're calling it most favored nation when they're trying to, one, talk about Trump, what is now Trump RX, or these direct to patient platforms. So the administration, probably at the advice of companies, have said, let's get into this business where we can really slash the price on a product and then offer that on your platform, Mr. President. And they go, okay, so that's part of most favored nation. Now, what we don't know about these three agreements is, was there any discounting for any of the public healthcare programs in the US, Medicare and Medicaid? Those agreements are private. And so if they did negotiate that price, there's been hints of it, but we really don't know because there's no transparency on those agreements. Very interesting. But back in May, when the tariffs came, I go, okay, there's some inequities here. One, you have strong national security tariffs, most favored nation tariffs, not so much, and a president who likes to put his imprimatur on everything that he does, and he loves to do deals. So I said, I think what he's going to do is he's going to try to negotiate waivers with these companies. And so he's been trying over the summer, he tried all kinds of tactics to get companies to commit. Most of them said, no, we're not going to play. Now we have three companies that, will we see others? Yeah, I think so. If they think that the trade-off of some kind of tariff, and I think this will be an exclusionary kind of waiver where it says, okay, you don't have any national security tariffs, you don't have any bilateral tariffs or any other pharmaceutical tariffs involved, including most favored nation. So that's not a bad deal for a company. Okay, we're going to get more access to our drugs using the president's platform, and we've negotiated some discounts for that, but we were going to reshore anyway. So let's bring these dollars back and start manufacturing in the US. Okay, not a bad deal if you're already kind of planning. The ace in the hole here, or I'd call it the ace, but lingering in the background, there is a new proposed rule that went to the Office of Management and Budget about 3 weeks ago. And it looks and reads, and they call it the block. And I can't remember what the acronym actually means, but they're basically global tariffs on pharmaceuticals. Smells a lot like most favored nation. So I think they're going to continue to put pressure on pharmaceutical companies to do these individual waiver agreements, but they're going to try to do it through this rulemaking. And I think the administration is probably saying, well, you're going to either pay me now or pay me later. So yeah, this rule may or may not work, but you're going to have to sue us. You're going to have to spend some legal money to block this. And if we wait this out, and it doesn't restrict, and keep in mind that no one knows, or the Supreme Court hasn't ruled on, whether the president's emergency authority to do these tariffs on various products has any authority. So until they decide that, the president can kind of keep throwing out numbers. And I think the last number he said, if you don't do one of these agreements with us, then you're going to have a 100% tariff on your pharmaceuticals and you don't reshore. So it's kind of this complex web that the president loves to gain some leverage and get these voluntary individual agreements because it all inures kind of back to his name and his legacy. So I still think that there's going to be a lot of pressure by the administration to try to continue these. Whether companies wait this out and endure either some court decisions or make some new legal challenges, we're going to have to see. But we heard rumblings that more companies are lined up. How many more and how many more that just say, nope, we're good. Give us the tariff. We'll continue to operate as we always have been, and we'll just try to wait you out for 3 years. But I think given the numbers, and I think there was like 17 different companies who said pledged money to reshore drug manufacturing, that's probably the target audience that they're trying to do negotiations with right now. The others, well, we'll tariff you, is probably the administration's opinion right now. So complex, I know, but again, this is the president who loves the deal. And so these negotiated waivers, I'm calling them, it was predictable, and I think the pressure is going to continue to unfold through the rest of the year. At some point, they'll do a rulemaking on national security tariffs, but they know they got all the companies over the barrel, so they'll wait until the last possible minute to push anything through on a rulemaking for that, and try to leverage these individual agreements.
You sit in a very unique place in the pharmaceutical and healthcare communication world. Most folks at an agency or a company, they kind of only see their piece of the pie. You get to see everything, sort of the whole pie, I suppose, or the whole map of what's happening amongst your members in the pharmaceutical and regulatory world. So, given that, I'm curious, what are some trends that you think folks maybe aren't noticing, some of the broad strategic trends in pharmaceutical marketing and communications, in the regulatory world that may come to pass over the next 3 to 5 years, but folks just aren't quite aware yet?
Yeah, I think we touched upon it earlier, and this is the idea of a more balance in any kind of broadcast. And when I'm saying broadcast, it could go through any digital channel. But I think you're getting into a different type of storytelling than what we've historically seen. And so the goal will be, can you convey the message to get the patients to move or to understand, on a particular branded drug, or even, other means through underbred, what the risks are, and will they go get more information to have a real good conversation? Keep in mind, one of the benefits of the whole movement of broadcast healthcare marketing has been the idea that actually patients will look and they've had undiagnosed conditions and they go, I've got those conditions. Maybe I should talk to my physician. And the research says that people who that light goes on and said, yeah, I've got these symptoms, I got these things, I need to go talk. They actually stick with their physician longer and again are more compliant, more adherent to any kind of plan that the physician or PA or NP and the patient agree upon. So that's a dynamic we've been talking about since the CCN, but I think this enhanced enforcement by the FDA kind of ups that game. And people will say, yeah, we have to take this a little bit more seriously. We can't use the old model that we've relied on for the last 20 years. We have to shift and how we communicate information. And I think it's also going to be more omni-channel approaches. So it's like, how do we not only engage through these channels, all these different channels, and we do it at the same time, but how do we bring on other actors, such as, say, a patient group or someone where there's higher trust for a particular disease or disorder, and say, how do we engage them? And how do we help? How can they be a part of, reinforcing the messaging that's necessary for this joint decision making? So I think that's number one, is probably the way we've been doing broadcast ads is changing. And I think companies now are going to have to change to get, can they deliver these messages that resonate and help patients and their providers act in a responsible way? So that's number one. Number two, at least for this administration, we have some dichotomies going on. We have a secretary who clearly doesn't like any kind of healthcare marketing, particularly for pharmaceuticals. And at times there's alignment with the president, like on issues that they feel kindred spirit, like autism, where they both had some experiences with autism. And so they're both, this is typically what I would call the secretary's approach. People don't realize that the secretary made his millions as a personal injury attorney. And so this idea of, okay, we're going to do a press conference and claim that Tylenol is the cause, and we're going to hold this in the court of public opinion. That's very much his approach, and maybe there. But there's other issues like how this may or may not impact the economy. Keep in mind the one barometer we know the president reacts to is the stock market and how the economy is doing. If that goes south, or big sectors of it go south, then the president is going to react. And he's publicly said, I don't want to tank the pharmaceutical industries. I want them actually to grow and to be better. I just want them back in this country. So that's, again, where there's some separation between the president and the secretary, and maybe the FDA. We'll kind of have to see how that. So knowing that this won't last forever, the secretary may or may not, how long the secretary is in place and pushing his particular agenda, we'll have to see. When you take a long view of policy, you go, okay, you'll survive the next 3 years as long as the country survives. But if we go forward, this companies have pivoted around particular policies and industries and made inroads during turbulent times. So I also talk to individuals who are just kind of scared, and I go, don't, because where there's change, this is the other big, there's opportunities. But you have to work harder in a very turbulent environment. You really have to dig in and kind of know the detail to draw out where the opportunities lie. And you really kind of have to look at the situation fresh and say, okay, this is what we've got. Where are these new opportunities? And why hasn't it occurred to me yet? So I think in any kind of turbulent environment, there was a former chief of staff said, never let any good crisis go to waste. And so that's what I would inform people who think that this is a crisis. And in many respects, it can be seen as that. Don't let it go to waste. Assess it, look deep, hard, and kind of figure out how you can pivot or change or look at the situation differently for the opportunities. Those are a couple of different ways, I think, to answer your question.
Two final questions for you, and they're sort
Mhm.
of reflection of each other. Since you became executive director of CHC, what have you learned and what has surprised you?
Great question. What have I learned and what has surprised me? I think when I came to this job, my background was more working with provider organizations. So I knew their perspective. So I knew a lot about HCP marketing and knew that. I really didn't know as much as DTC. So getting in and really learning the details in the history, but there's a blessing with that. It's like any convert to a new religion, you usually know the essence of that religion and the details and everything a whole lot better than people who have been living it their whole life. So as a convert, I've been, the village idiot that gets in here and goes way into the weeds and says, okay, why is this like this? And what's the history here? And when I'm talking to audiences, it's people who've been in the business, they go, oh, I didn't realize that was the history. I didn't realize that those were the Supreme Court precedents. that, free speech is a part of commercial advertising. Those two are strongly linked. And even, having the secretary say that in, I think, his May hearing, it was like, oh, they've been reading our talking points. How nice. The thing that surprised me, I think, most was how the healthcare marketing industry doesn't promote itself. And the pharmaceutical industry does even worse. They don't talk collectively, they don't talk about the benefits to the patients. And so when I do policy making, have always used, I learned this early on, I have a 5 finger rule when you talk about health policy. One, it should be good for patients. If it's not good for patients, don't do the policy. Two, it should be good for caregivers, those supporting the patient and those who provide the care to the patient. Three, it should be good to the healthcare system. Four, it should be good for the economy. And fifth, it should be good for the companies and the industry. But the industry is more product driven and has been for time. And even its patient-centric marketing is more product-driven. No one wants to admit that, but from my vantage, that's what I see. So when I talk about this and we mention some of these things, well, do you know, really what the goal of healthcare marketing is? Because when you know that and everybody can support that idea, do you know that there are hundreds of disease states where there was stigma? I got involved back when I came out of school. I got involved and was involved with breast cancer and helped change the breast cancer regulations and laws so that screening is now routinely done. I remember I was in meetings where convincing the NFL that wearing pink, you needed to, support breast cancer. And so they got in behind that. So the big thing here is I think the industry really has to be able to articulate, how does the patient benefit? How does the patient benefit from the messaging that we do in the marketing? How do they benefit? How does the particular drug benefit them in distinct ways? Not through everybody's happy on the commercial, but you have to be able to kind of more specifically tell them. Essentially, that's what I kind of read between the lines, that FDA is seeking a little bit more, but that's part and parcel of the CCN rule. They're just trying to enforce it tighter. So I think the more that it surprised me that no one could talk about the industry and you didn't promote the industry. I go, well, why are you in this? Then I would go, let me list out 5 or 6 ways where I think you should be, because I think you love this business, but you can't articulate it. So we have actually developed with our board, we have developed like 14, what I'll call facts. And we basically make a fact like prescription drug marketing promotes compliance and adherence. And then we go through and we make citations to the literature that supports that. And so it's more of backwards, but those are the type of things we should be talking about more and more when we talk to patients, when we talk to policymakers. And it's gotten lost. So the more that I think, again, kind of go back to the more that we can do storytelling, because maybe we haven't been doing storytelling as well as we think we should have to patients. More can be patient focused first. And then the more that we can communicate them the benefits of the communications that we're putting out, how that benefits them in their developing their treatment plan, and they understand what is the best option for them from a efficiency standpoint, from a treatment standpoint, from a cost standpoint. All those things will kind of figure into say, oh, can I afford this treatment? Or can I take this treatment that's not as good, but the efficacy is good? So those are the things I think that and as we do storytelling, if we can evolve that, then I think everyone succeeds. Mostly, I think we do better by patients, and in doing that, the industry grows. Without it, if we kind of go rely on the way we've been doing things for the last 50 years, then you're probably getting in a more regulated market, one that you don't like or don't, really want to be a part of. So the choices are ours to make. We're going to have to be good advocates, good stewards in how we go after this. But it really, what I tell everybody is like, when things are up in the air, it's engagement. You got to engage. You got to get active. You got to really kind of do your homework doubly now than when things are just kind of going along, making good profits. I'm doing, yeah. No, that's not the world we're in right now. So realize there's just real big dynamics here, and there's big opportunities, and there's opportunities to really for it to turn in really bad ways. But we're advocating that everyone become much more engaged.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for your time and your insight, your leadership of CHC. Any final words for our audience?
Just thank you for your time, and MedEd News for all that they do to help promote the industry and move patient care forward.